Hello, this is DC Hammer, and this is the DC Hammer Show. So we've got a treat for today. I'm joined by other members of the team, and we are discussing a variety of issues in an Open Mind Friday episode. And this will be a roundtable discussion, and I have Arrow, Abigail, Brainstorm, and even Bandit may be able to join us coming in and out, and we're going to go into a couple interesting topics, go through them in kind of a free-flowing discussion format. So, Abigail, are you there?
Yes, hello. Glad to be here.
And Arrow?
Hello.
And Brainstorm?
Ooh.
Hey, and then Bandit, if you're able?
I am for right now.
Okay. There's a variety of articles that are covering the same topic, but the overarching issue is the fact that the Red Dragon, as I call it, the Communist Chinese, have infiltrated the United States educational system in a variety of ways. And this is part of their worldwide initiative as they have gone beyond just the One Belt, One Road. They've gone beyond capturing elites like Dinosaur Dianne Feinstein and others. They've gone beyond influencing nations by taking over their economic systems, by offering them loans that then end up becoming a debt trap, and forcing them, and this is all over the globe, from Africa to Asia, the South America now, you name it, that the Red Dragon, the Communist Chinese, are using their debt ploy, and the way they deploy their debt ploy is to offer infrastructure funding for a variety of programs, whatever the state needs, whether it's in Africa and they need roads or bridges or whatever. They offer to fund it through their own banks. But what this does is it's kind of a facade, it's a lure, it's a trap in that these countries cannot afford what they are doing, and they are lured into accepting these financial, no, they're the opposite of gifts. They're financial hooks. And so these poor countries don't have the ability to fund these infrastructure projects themselves. So they look for outsiders to help them do that, whether it be investors or foreign governments. The Red Dragon moves in and says, here's the money. We'll help you build that bridge. All you have to do is sign on the bottom line. But there's a catch. And the catch is you got to pay us back. And with these governments, and many of them are corrupt, many of them are mismanaged, many of the people that are running these countries have no clue when it comes to financial issues. They sign on the bottom line. China starts to punch the money into the program, and as soon as that country starts to default, then the Chinese move in and replace all the workers with Chinese workers, take over the entire infrastructure program, actually start to do things that take over the government itself. The government of New Zealand has been dealing with that, where there's now members of the government itself that owe their allegiance more primarily to Red China than they do to New Zealand. And there's a diaspora movement China has used, and that is they set up these communities around the world. They send out people to become educated at American institutions, let's say, or other educational institutions around the world, and they keep tabs on them, and they pull them back or keep them deployed based on what works the best for the Communist Chinese, and whether that means having them infiltrate American companies and then push military secrets, intellectual property secrets, and so on back to Mother Dragon, or if they then just become educated and then come back to Communist China to become educators within the Chinese system, or work within Chinese companies to help with the forced transfer of technology from American companies working in China, and so on. So with everything that the Communist Chinese are doing, the Red Dragon is doing, one of the main techniques they are doing now in order to fulfill their China 2025 goals, which is by 2025, the Communist Chinese, the Red Dragon, intends to completely dominate the world. That may sound like you can't believe that what you just heard, but they're making dramatic progress in achieving that. And one of the main initiatives that they've launched against the United States is by taking over our educational systems through a variety of ploys, one of them being Confucius Institutes. And so anybody want to kick in and talk about exactly what this is all about?
Just one thing that I'm thinking as I'm listening to you talk about this, and as I'm scanning the first article that you referenced, is I was raised by parents who did not have secret hidden agendas, and I think most Middle Americans were. And we're not prepared to, I mean, emotionally, mentally, I don't think most Americans are prepared to catch this kind of infiltration. What are all these hidden agendas in our world? I mean, and I think that our innocence has made us more willing victims because we're not prepared. We don't anticipate that some country on the other side of the world is going to be spending billions of dollars to trick our children and to educate our children according to their agenda.
Yeah, I agree with that, because we're not really built to be spies, but we're being forced into that position. I think even more than being citizen journalists, I think we're being forced into some kind of role of being like amateur spies in our own, just to be able to survive the situation that's going on. It's not just China either. It's like, I mean, all the stuff like the GCHQ stuff and whatever they're doing there, and they got the Nazi versus communist, the false dichotomy that they're presenting as, within the educational environment. It's like, if you're not a communist, you must be a Nazi. It's like they've forgotten, when we were in there, it was in World War II. You had communism, you had Nazism, and you had capitalism. But they tend, in the universities, they equate capitalism with fascism and talk about fascism and all the things that fascism does is bad. And they don't, and they act as if that's capitalism's problem. So that false dichotomy gets people into choosing between the two, which is worse, Hitler or Mao.
Right. And so what's interesting, Arrow, you were bringing up an important point about it, and this ties into exactly what Brain was just talking about, that this isn't just communist China that's doing this. We've actually been under attack from, what do you want to call it, Turkey? Or you understand what I'm talking about? Why don't you give us the lead in for that?
Yeah, the whole charter school Gulen thing, that came from Turkey, and that had to do with the Islamicist takeover. And it's not maybe as broad of a cultural takeover as the Chinese one, because the Chinese has the veneer of this is just an ethnic group of a very large country. Islam has a different agenda. They're a religion. So I think it's easier for people to see that infiltration once they know about it. But this guy, Gulen, that had set up charter schools and is now headquartered out of Pennsylvania, rural Pennsylvania. What he was up to is very well known by General Flynn, and that was one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons General Flynn experienced such heavy pushback from the deep state, because he understood this agenda. Really, the capstone of all of this whole infiltration agenda is the level of betrayal by our own elites, so-called, that have been in positions of power throughout the infrastructure of the mostly federal government, but it is in state levels as well. So you've got Islam on the one hand through the Gulen charter school system, and you've got this Confucian-oriented so-called. Now, I think Confucius is great if you actually study his teachings. He understood human nature and he understood righteousness, and great stuff, but you use that as a veneer to say, we want you to understand Chinese philosophy so that you can participate in this emerging Chinese new century.
Wasn't Confucius was one of the things that got rid of in the cultural revolution?
Exactly. Right? So what this is actually, I think it's probably operates, the deception there, I think, operates on a couple of levels, because they got rid of the communist Chinese in the Cultural Revolution, got rid of all of this old stuff so they could bring in the new, but now they want to use that widely accepted veneer as the Chinese good stuff to be the cultural candy that gets the people into the communist way of thinking. And the bottom line is, it's something that they control. And so Confucius can be whatever the communist Chinese say Confucius is, because it's a whole broad area. And there's Taoism and as well as the Confucianism, two schools of thought within Chinese culture are very important. And Westerners are so ignorant that they can be told that they are whatever they want them to be. And then Westerners will go along thinking that they're just being better educated and participating in some global. So, there's a lot of deception going on there on two fronts, and as I see it.
Put your spy hat on, though, because if you actually look in China, they're killing off the Muslims there, and so it's not the people that we're up against. Well, they're not Muslim, they're not Jewish, they're not Catholic, they're none of those things really. The people that we're after,
those are just fronts. Yeah.
Well, but even that, it's like like Saudi Arabia. We had this. We had this big thing where we got rid of the worst branch of the House of Saud. But where does the House of Saud come from, and what brand of Islam do they use? Well, that's Wahhabism. It's technically part of the Sunni tradition, but it's actually not Sunni because its origins can be traced back to Turkey and the Donme, and the Donme are actually not Muslim. I mean, and this is the spy part of it, is like there's a group, if you go back to 1666, Sabbatai, I don't know how to say it, Sabbatai Zevi.
Sabbateans.
Yeah, the Sabbateans, when they go into whatever environment they're in, okay, first of all, they're a heretical Jewish branch. They're not Jewish themselves, but Sabbatai Zevi he was a false messiah, and this false messiah, basically their attitude is they flip everything upside down because they think if they can do evil in the world, they can force God to bring the Messiah. So they actually have some kind of theological justification for doing evil things. But the point is that every place there they go, if they're in Islam, they pretend to be Islamic. And that goes back to this. So this Wahhabi guy and all the people after that follow him, it's a false Islam. It's not real Islam. And so, but they use that actually as a way to divide all the Muslim people against each other and give Islam a bad name in the process. And so that's where like some of this terrorist stuff is coming from. But that's also in the Jewish part of it too. They also have fake Jews that are doing, that they, when they're in Jewish presence, then they pretend to be Jewish. And but then they had the Frankists going up into Poland and Hungary and all that stuff, and they were known as Frankists there, and they're fake Christians. So no matter where they are, they put on this fake hat. They pretend to be something they're not, and so it's part of their culture to be in this kind of spy mode. It's not just the experts that the like spies that are professional spies. They're all spies. It's like there's this whole culture of spies.
Yeah, and it's interesting, back to the communist infiltration, it's interesting how it's so broad and so deep, but so infrequently reported that there's only a few news outlets, even on the alternative side, that have done a good job of reporting exactly what is going on with the communist incursion beyond the Islamic incursion. And then there's this organization that online, they're called the Epoch Times, and they do some outstanding reporting on a variety of things. And they've gone into a deep dive into, and they call it's a special series, how the specter of communism is ruling our world. And they've done all 20 or 30 reports on it. They do it chapter by chapter. And their chapter 12 was how the Red Dragon, Communist China, sabotaging the educational system, not just in the United States, as that specter of communism disappeared in Eastern Europe, in other words, as the Soviet Union fell apart, and then just splintered off into nation states that were fragmented from the former Soviet Union and became Russia and Ukraine and a variety of other states. The Chinese, have used this opportunity, and especially against the United States, to use our educational systems as weapons against us. They've weaponized, especially in the United States, with these 100 Confucius Institutes, and that's a ploy. It's a veneer for teaching kids to trust communism, to be enlightened in Chinese culture, to adopt their approach to the world. And at the same time, they are capturing our elites. That's what they call it, elite capture. They get to people in influence, like have a spy be a driver for a senator from California for 20 years, and she also uses this spy as one of her office helpers. And when that is uncovered, then that spy will go back to the mother country, will go back to the Red Dragon, the den of the Red Dragon, and then they'll just go down another path. They're relentless. It's an oil slick kind of a spill into our culture and into our educational system. And I know, Abigail, that you, as a mother, have to be extremely concerned about just how deep the tentacles of the Red Dragon have gone when it's come to infecting the American educational system.
Well, I definitely am. I sent my own children to Christian schools, but my grandchildren are in public schools, and I know this is just pervasive. And we might as well, if we can agree that socialism is virtually the same thing as communism, with just a maybe less threatening name. And socialism is, openly preached, very openly preached among the Democrats, and with Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, and they have completely embraced socialism. And it's the same thing as communism. It's the same concept. It's the promise of giving, basically, it's the promise of giving people something for nothing. Well, what young, innocent person isn't going to think that sounds like something good? Hey, no matter how intelligent or dumb you are, no matter how lazy or aggressive you are, we are going to take care of you. Just trust us. That's very appealing to somebody who's naive and doesn't realize that, this is a worm on a hook, and that hook is going to pierce your mouth, and you are going to be trapped for the rest of your life.
And just as the leftists in this country have changed the history books and changed the teaching that goes on regarding the founding fathers, the basis of our nation, the importance of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, every aspect of our culture is under attack by the left. And at the same time now, the Chinese have used similar inroads into our educational system to start at the lowest grades and to work their way up and to try to teach communism to our kids. And they especially want them to adopt what they consider the virtues of the Chinese flavor of communism.
Yeah, that's the most dangerous. But, socialism/communism has been weaponized against the middle class over and over again. And because the elite controllers don't want there to be a middle class, they don't want there to be people who can be independent and think for themselves and determine their own way. And this promise of something for nothing is used, and everybody points to Venezuela. It's such an easy example. You're not getting what you think you're getting. It's a Trojan horse. There's nothing good. It might look good on the outside, but it bears this horrible set of precepts and this law that comes in that completely destroys your independence.
Yeah.
Well, that's the part where the socialist is just a very patient communist. Like that. But that's actually the Bolsheviks revolution in Russia. They were the ones that were actually in the minority. They're the ones that did that in the Soviet Union, but they were actually in the minority. The Mensheviks were the ones that were more the majority, and they ended up taking over in the long run. So that became the long, slow march through the institutions and the Fabian Society in the UK. But that whole business, it's what they do. They talk about class distinctions and class divides and the class war, and saying that any class distinctions inevitably lead to class struggle and class warfare, which is already a wrong assumption. Just because somebody's of a different class doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be at war with them. But they preach that it is. But what they do then is they promise the poor people that they can have all the things of the middle class. Meanwhile, they attack the middle class. They don't actually attack the rich people because the rich people are themselves. The rich people always have tax loopholes and offshore banks and stuff like that. They can hide their money. So the only people that end up getting hurt by socialism are the middle class. So what communism, socialism really amounts to is a war against the middle class, so that there's a permanent division between the rich and poor. And that's why it doesn't really matter if you're a communist or you're a fascist, because it's either the government controlling the corporation or the corporation controlling the government. But in either a communist scenario or in a fascist scenario, they're the same people. Yep. Because the richest people are going to be the ones in positions in both cases.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I was illuminated on a lot of these issues by the audiobook that I listened to by Dr. Jerome Corsi, as he talked about how communism has taken over the Democrat Party. And this goes back to what Abigail was saying, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sounding like the Karl Marx wing of the Democrat Party. And I think, Errol, you also listened to that audiobook of Dr. Corsi's, did you not?
Unfortunately, I didn't listen to the whole thing, only parts of it, but I have a general understanding of all those issues. I've been following them myself.
What's interesting is this article from the Epoch Times, when it's talking about what's happened with the infiltration of communism into the United States. 30 years ago, back in the 1980s, there was a KGB defector. His name was Yuri Bezmenov, and he described that how communist ideology infiltration, and now we're talking 30 years ago, in America was quote unquote nearing completion. And this is his main quote. Even if you start right now, here this minute, you start educating a new generation of Americans, in other words, in non-communist ideology, it will still take you 15 to 20 years to turn the tide of ideological perception of reality back to normalcy. That was in the 1980s. Imagine how much time it'll take us to reverse that trend now.
Everybody should watch that YouTube clip. That was one of my very first awakening clips as I began to be educated on the internet. We should put it as a link in this broadcast so that people can refer to it themselves. But yeah, that is just, in a nutshell, he says, you're on a road and you won't be able to get off of it. And I'd like to speak to the whole idea of collectivization of society and whether or not that's even possible in America. These people, like Yuri, believe that it was possible and would be completed. I believe, just due to America's history, unless we get a full-on foreign invasion, which is actually in process, that it won't be possible just because of the background and the cultural ethos of America. Now that's being eroded, and that's part of what he's talking about. But Western individualism has been, in my opinion, basically fueled by the Christian ethos of the individual being primarily responsible to God. And I go back to the period of the Reformation when every man was responsible before God and had his own scripture Bible that he could reference.
Well, and you just mentioned one of the key words, and that is God. One of the key attacks on the educational system, and this goes back to the 1950s, 1960s, was to remove God from the educational system. Everybody needs to remember that back when this country was founded, all of the universities, all of the institutions of higher education were started by God-believing, faith-based Christians and others that believed strongly in a divine being. And Harvard, Yale, you name the institution on the East Coast, they were all started with a faith base, and one of the primary learning tools, even in the elementary schools back in the 1800s, 1900s, was the Bible. And to teach that, all of the precepts of the Bible, how they translate over, how you treat other people and how you think yourself, and the belief in a higher being, and not just that you are everything, which has happened now in the Oprah generation and so on. Everything is, I am God and all of these other crazy notions. That was a dramatic turning point in the 1960s. And if you remember the comedian Red Skelton, he was famous back in the 50s and 60s. He had his own show, and he made a unbelievable speech about what he saw going on in the educational system back in the 60s. And he talked about how if you take God out of the school, and if you start going down this path, you're going to destroy the educational system, because belief in God, whether you are, believe as Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, as I do, and I know Dr. Corsi does, that's one thing. But to believe in, that have a faith in a higher being of some kind, instead of everything focused on you, and everything focused on the government, and everything focused on the teachers as kind of your God in the classroom, that he was a sage, he was a prophet, saying that when you go down this road, it will be to destruction. And he said that 50 years ago.
I have to interject on this just in spirit of syncretism. I don't know. But anyway, it's like, I think the most important thing is that you have some kind of concept of the sacred, some notion in your head that there is such a thing as sacred, because that's what sets apart your experience in the world, that there is some kind of higher reality, some kind of higher authority to which you will answer, and that gives you a moral guidepost, and it will also provide you with an orientation to your life. It gives you meaning, because without that objective or a belief in the objective truth or objective goodness, then everything becomes relativistic and eventually nihilistic, because there's no real reason to do anything if there's not some kind of objective good. And I think it's mostly in the discipline of, cultural anthropology. They point out the simple truism that there are many different religious systems in the world, and hence there's going to be different moral systems. And they conclude falsely that because there exists different ethical systems, that there's no objective way of knowing right from wrong, and there is no objective right and wrong. So that conclusion is what leads them to preach moral relativism. And so that's why the younger generation coming up, they think that, it's whatever you do, whatever you want to do. And that's really just Crowleyism. That's Thelema. That's he's known as the Great Beast. That Crowleyan do what thy wilt, that should be the whole of the law, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there was ancient law that we would, as, moral people would think is just, like Hammurabi's Code. And, but just throughout the ages, natural law or common law. And it's interesting because I've had some disputes on Facebook in the past with Wiccans who think that what they embrace is natural law, but I'm referring to natural law of basically do no harm, and those are the two opposing concepts: is do as thou wilt and do no harm. And I think those are polar opposites. And one thing that I don't know a whole lot about the Chinese Revolution, but I've read and to be honest, watched films about the Russian Revolution, and it seems to me that in large measure the Russian Revolution at a certain point was to rid that country of their Christian faith, and especially the monarchy. And I've read that Tsar Nicholas was a genuine Christian man, and that family was, they genuinely were Christian. They seemed to try to help people more or less, which put them, I think, in opposition to the families like the Rothschilds, who were, seemed to be, and from what we've all read and heard, more in the do as thou wilt sort of a camp.
Yeah, I actually think it's kind of along the lines of the do what thou wilt thing. I think it's kind of along the lines of the might makes right sort of mentality, that it's whoever can, if you can take the thing, then it's okay for you to do so. And it's kind of ironic because the people on the left always give us a hard time about, when we came here, we took all the land away from the natives and all that, so it's ironic actually that they're the ones that are actually preaching that, without preaching it. They're not overtly preaching it, but without any sort of moral guidelines. The only thing that there is left is just raw power. But if you have a combination of power and righteousness, that's when you have a legitimate authority. because you can't have legitimate authority just by being right. You have to have the power to complement it to enforce the laws, as it were. So if you don't have power, then you don't have legitimate authority. But neither, if you don't have righteousness, do you have legitimate authority.
Yeah, and part of the communist philosophy is that might makes right, and they then take over different sectors of a nation, different segments of thought, and become the philosophers that then take it from ideas to action. And there's a lot of those philosophers that were weaned in communism and became such staunch believers and that pushed communism, or ideas that became absorbed into communism, such as Jean-Paul Sartre. What he talked about, and I'm looking for it right now, there's a quote from him. Here it is. Sartre wrote, "For in the days of the revolt, you must kill. To shoot down a European is to kill two birds with one stone. To destroy an oppressor and the man he oppresses at the same time. There remain a dead man and a free man. The survivor, for the first time, feels a national soil under his foot."
Wow.
That's pretty strong stuff.
Yes, it is. It is. And, one of the first things I said when we began this conversation was I don't think most people in Middle America are prepared for this kind of an onslaught. We don't anticipate that somebody would be that determined to control or destroy us.
Well, they declared war against us without telling us we were at war. It's the subversion thing. They're not even honest enough to put up a fair fight, because if they wanted to engage in a fair fight, especially a battle of ideas, we could beat them. But this has been happening behind the scenes in all these, back rooms and stuff. This has all been happening without us knowing it. If we would have known about it, we maybe could have done something. But they've used this secrecy and deceit and all that stuff to manipulate the masses and our culture. They take over Hollywood first, because the part of this long, slow march through the institution is they say culture. First, you have to take over the culture industry. So that means Hollywood, and that means the university system, and that means the news media, all that stuff. So they take over the culture industry, then they take over the political institutions, and finally they end up at the economic. So that's the long, slow march.
Along that way, what they do is they then politicize everything to fit their narrative. And what they do that is an insert in all of the educational institutions that they take over by becoming professors that then become tenured, that then become department heads, that then run the universities. They ensure that their Marxist communist philosophy then pervades all the way down through not only the teaching that's the spoken word from the professor standing in front of the class, but also then the research that they use to have everything spun in a way that proves their narrative, to have all the books that are used in the teaching to be then models for what they believe. Back in the 60s and the 70s, there were a variety of books that came out from these radicals that were beginning to take over on the educational scene, and this started in sociology and philosophy, and then went into all of the other sciences except for the natural sciences and math, chemistry, and biology. But they're still, at this point in time, they're even pushing their thoughts into those areas. How many genders are there now? But you call it the long march. It's been a long, steady march. And if you've been a frog in the pot, allowing them to turn up the heat, and you've been boiled, yes. But there have been a lot of signs along the way that anybody should have been able to see what was being done to us.
You only get to do the research if you get the funding. You have to apply for a research grant, and the only time you get the research grant is when you have that communist sort of conclusions already. That's what you're determined to do.
It's just like if you want to make money by being an educator that is tied to climate science. If you're not talking about global warming and climate change, you are not going to get any of the funding.
Yeah, so what is your guys' take on McCarthy and McCarthyism? I mean, everybody kind of thought he was a nut, but the guy was, was calling it out way back then. What happened?
What happened was the pushback against him, and yes, a lot of the investigations that were taking place during the 50s became excessive, and he became an alcoholic, and he had a variety of other problems. But his basic premise that communism had infiltrated all of the different bureaucracies in this country, and it was headed towards the educational system and had taken over Hollywood, were absolutely correct. But he was an eccentric, he was excessive, some of his hearings just got out of control. He was kind of a anti-communist version of Ocasio-Cortez. He was flamboyant and verbose and got into these sessions during his hearings where he would just go too far, and that enabled then the people that not just leftists to fight back against him, but even people that were centrists and on the right to fight back, to just say that he must be crazy because he is just going off on these tangents too far. And you ended up then, especially in the attack on Hollywood, there were actors that absolutely were communists, and directors and writers and producers that were absolutely communists. And there were some good people on the right that came and appeared before the House Committee on Communism, that committee that John Huston was one that spoke about the dangers of communism and how they had infiltrated Hollywood. But there were others that were well-respected actors and so on. The Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall came to Congress and appeared before the committee and talked about it being a witch hunt, and that the attacks that McCarthy was waging against individuals was excessive and inappropriate. And the whole thing then ended melting down when McCarthy then kind of drifted into the booze bottle and just became unable to focus and keep it contained to the facts he could prove. And it's now gone down in history as a stain on the Congress, and as if all of his allegations were untrue. But the more you look into it, the more you realize that McCarthy was right, but his approach was flawed.
Right, and I was going to say, it's almost like now, knowing what we know now, today, it was almost like possibly that was a stunt by Hollywood, that, they wanted him to look bad, so they pulled out all the stops to make him look bad, knowing what we know now and how infiltrated it really is. He really might have been onto something, and it's too bad that he couldn't have followed through back then.
Yeah, it occurred to me that you said maybe somebody forced him or pushed him toward alcoholism. Sometimes looking back, you see that, a person's whole career was a contrivance. And I don't think he probably was. Sometimes things just do happen, but I've quite honestly, people joke about it, but I've wondered about Ocasio-Cortez being some kind of a right-wing plant, or, maybe not, maybe she doesn't even know it, but maybe somebody has set her up to be in this position. And sometimes we don't know. And there's so much that goes on behind the scenes.
Well, she's creating apparently an enemies list now. And she is calling out the moderates in the Democrat Party. And she is saying she's going to actively work against the members of the Democrat Party that aren't left enough. And she's going to take action to try to see that in the next election cycle, in the 2020 election cycle, that all of the moderates in the Democrat Party are weeded out and replaced with communists. She didn't say the word communist, but that's what she means.
Yeah, I think she got in trouble with her base, too, that when Bernie Sanders declared she didn't support him, and I think the thinking is that he's not commie enough for her tastes.
Oh boy!
I think they might use her as a pivot point. I think that they might because Dianne Feinstein has already people have already, some of the Dems have already been critical of her. I think they might point to her and say, look, I'm not like that. That's not who I am. As kind of so that they can delineate themselves, when of course they are. Under subterfuge, That's exactly what they all want. All those things. She talks about it openly, and I think they might use her to come. I won't say right, but I can't even say center. I choke on the word if I try to say it. Use her to try to distance themselves from her extremism.
Well, one of the problems that the Democrat Party has now is there's two primary factions. There's the dinosaurs, like Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, Schumer, and even Bernie Sanders, these people that are in their 70s and even into the 80s with Dianne Feinstein, that are the old guard leftists. And then you've got the rising young, kind of the communist tigers like Ocasio-Cortez aligning herself with the young Islamists like Omar and forming this young against old. And where are the moderate Democrats that are middle-aged, kind of in the center there, and why have they allowed themselves to be muted, to be silenced? And you've got the old team that's on their way out on one side, and the young team that wants to drag the entire Democrat Party off the cliff into total communist doctrine. Where is that voice of Democrats in the center? They must see that there's a danger on one side and the other. If they don't speak up and become the solution, where is the Democrat Party?
You realize you're talking about Trump's genius right here. That was all because of the wall, because he forced them into that position where they had to go further left, and so as a result, then all those moderate Democrats are like, whoa, wait a minute, So they either have to declare a new party that's independent of the DNC, or else they have to come over to our side.
And they've got a new party. It's called the Democrat Socialists of America. They just haven't. Now, do you think, what's the thinking here, that the Ocasio-Cortez wing of the party is going to break off and actually use the mantra of the Democratic Socialists of America to become an actual party unto itself? Or will they just try to continue to take over the existing Democrat Party and make that their base?
Either way, it's good for us because they're fighting each other.
It's not good for America.
It's good for America in the simple fact that the Democrats that vote Democrat hardcore across the board are now going to be split, because when it comes, I'm guaranteeing you this, I'm marking this, when 2020 comes around, there will be two presidential, it will split, and there will be two presidential nominees from the Democrat Party. I don't care what you want to call them, the old guard and the new guard, whatever. There will be two nominees, and it'll split the Democrat voters in half.
The Democrats can only have one nominee. And so when it gets down to the point, there might be a couple that are fighting against each other. They have the prominent support within their party behind them. But when it comes down to the convention, only one walks away as a victor. And unless they splinter off and create a completely different entity, and between now and 2020 do it in a way that enables them to make it a force that could have its own convention to actually have a nominee that would be on the ballot.
That's what I'm saying is going to happen. That's what I am saying is going to happen. They're going to, I don't care if you want to call it an independent. I don't care if we're going to end up like Germany and there's going to be, four parties running, whatever. But I do believe it's going to splinter off. They're at war with each other too hard to come together for the 2020 election.
But they're united in their hatred of President Trump.
But they're not that smart. No, I'm not being facetious here.
Yeah, I understand.
They truly shoot themselves in the foot on a daily basis. And I truly believe they're not smart enough to get together and say, hey, let's unite, let's find a common cause, and let's have one common presidential so we can try and beat Trump. I truly don't believe that's going to happen. I truly believe they're going to splinter up, but that's just my belief. But and we got 2 years. We'll call it.
Yeah, and it's the triumph of passion and hate, the negative emotions over reason and moderation. You got the United States, and however many voters there are, I just cannot see any kind of an outcome that would drag the right to the left to give them the majority that would bring them into significant power. They can have a few loons in the House and the Senate for maybe a period of time, and maybe this is like Brain is saying, the brilliance, an underlying brilliance, and maybe a 4D chess move on the part of President Trump is to continue to do things in a way that shines the light on their darkness, that enables the American public to realize these aren't nuances. These are significant differences. And what do you want to be? Do you want to be a member of a society that is moving forward and positive, or do you want to be a member of a faction that wants to burn everything down?
These two factions that are at war right now, there's the evil ones and the stupid ones. So the evil ones are smart enough to know what's really going on, but the stupid ones are the ones that are drinking the Kool-Aid. And they actually,
It's not poison in that Kool-Aid. It's just some kind of a narcotic. You listen to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and when those eyes go wide open and words start to come out of her mouth, it's like, what? But she thinks she's the bee's knees. She thinks she's the future of the Democrat Party.
She's the boss.
She's the boss.
Yeah, but a lot of the younger generations are thinking that she's like, they agree with that. They think she's like really smart and she's got great plans and stuff. Nobody talks about the $92 trillion it would cost to actually fund her ideas. But, that's anybody like of an older generation that has a little bit of common sense, they would never go for that. But all the younger ones who are completely idealistic and have no rational abilities whatsoever, they're the ones that are saying, yeah, let's do that because that sounds fun.
Yeah, and unfortunately, my view on this is it's some of the dragging down of the educational system that goes back to the 60s with Bill Ayers and lunatics like that, the Students for a Democratic Society, what a joke that was. They were just, that era of communism and with the Jane Fondas and so on influencing Hollywood and the culture, and that toxic mix of pulling away from traditional teaching that was based on teach people how to learn, teach people basic concepts of the value of our principles, our traditions, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Teach them that, and then allow them to go off on different directions and to learn for themselves and become lifelong learners. And I know, Brain, you've got a lot of passion for the lifelong learning component. Instead, it's sit there, I'm going to tell you how to think, and these are the things that we're telling you are true. And you don't need to read books. You don't need to do anything. You've got your little, kind of like the Mao's, the little red book with the Chinese, what the communists are doing in this country now. It's ecology and gender confusion. And now we can kill babies even when they're out of the womb. And these fried brains do not have the capability to think. They don't have rational thought as a basis of how they go forward. They just, what have I heard? What have I been told? What did I see on Instagram? What did Facebook tell me today? And that's what their belief system is based on.
Well, so the Ocasio generation, we're going to call them the zombies. And the previous generation, the evil ones, we're going to call them vampires.
Okay.
There's the vampires versus the zombies.
And the middle of the Democrat Party is sitting there with the zombies on one side and the vampires on the other side, and in front of us is the dinosaur. So if you were a moderate Democrat, what would you do?
Yeah, what I see happening is that the vampires believe that they can control the zombies, and that's how they believe they're going to win the war. And they have enough rationality that they can recognize how they can manipulate emotion. But that's what it's all about. It's all about manipulating emotion. And this is why the elites always make their big shifts in periods of social upheaval. They welcome opportunities when everything is topsy-turvy because they know that's when people are the most emotional. And that's also why President Trump has been using the slow, gradual approach to everything he does, because he knows that disempowers the people that want to have these huge false flags and turn the tables and run everything by emotion. He's stopping that at every turn, while at the same time he is getting them to react emotionally to the things that don't really matter, the things that he throws out there on Twitter, He does to enrage them. He enrages them purposely.
Right. And the left has learned that they think their key to victory is chaos and violence. And that's why they will not let somebody like Ben Shapiro come and talk on their campuses. Because he comes in and stands there, and he's a calm, rational thinker, and he will then say to them, facts do not care about your feelings. And that's the trap that the left is in. They think their feelings are facts.
And that is why Antifa is no longer around now that President Obama is no longer around.
You know, DC, I was thinking about when you were talking about culture and influencing through culture. I remember probably only the baby boomers in the group will remember the term generation gap.
Yep.
They used to talk about, you don't hear that anymore. I mean, yeah, every generation is somewhat different, but I think that the reason they really pushed that concept of a generation gap was to use that concept to make us feel like we had a gap. And the gap, they wanted the gap to be between the people who understood the concepts of having a democratic republic and what the value of America. And this happened, I think it was to splinter the baby boomers from their parents who were more conservative. And now they're not that worried by parents. I mean, they don't need to emphasize a generation gap anymore because most parents are not a threat. Most parents are not trying to prevent their kids from having this socialism and communism preached to them in their schools.
And that,
I am.
Yeah. So
parents aren't even trying to be parents anymore. They've desensitized. It's like
exactly.
It's like the schools are the parents now.
And what's the culture changed in the 60s when you had Dr. Spock started teaching that it's all about self-esteem and no spanking and all of that, spare the rod and spoil the child kind of stuff. That's what ended up happening. But we turned away from respecting our parents and taking discipline from them from a point of they love us and they want us to learn from our mistakes and not repeat them. But what the left uses against you is if you try to, and what was that football player a couple of years ago whacked his kid because the kid had done something and he was suspended for 6 weeks or something, that fullback from I think it was the Vikings or whatever, and it's gotten into the society now that you cannot discipline your child, because disciplining your child, even if it's not corporal punishment, even if it's just berating them in some way to get them to understand that they've erred and they need to not do that again and to change their behavior, even taking steps like that is viewed upon by this new generation as child abuse.
On that same note, they took corporal punishment out of schools. When I was in school, if you acted up, you got a swat with a big paddle across your butt. And you know what? You learned. And you didn't go home and tell mom and dad, because then you were going to get it again once you got home. And they took that out of school.
You got Peter Pan, right? They actually now Pan was a Greek mythology, right?
With the flute.
It's basically you don't want to grow up. It's when the id rules the day. So you got Peter Pan and his gang of lost boys, and you notice there's a movie called The Lost Boys, and it's about a bunch of vampires. Because when little kids that grow up without an authority figure, when they grow up, they become vampires.
Either literally or figuratively, they just grow up. It's like Lord of the Flies. There was this movie back in the 50s, I think it was, or the 60s, where this airplane crashes. I think it was an airplane or a boat sinks or something, and this group of young boys ends up on an island by themselves, and within weeks they have turned into tribal, bloodthirsty, they're preying on each other and beating each other up just because they have no disciplinary foundation once their fathers and mothers were removed from keeping them in line.
So the loss of legitimate authority is the loss of civilization.
Yep.
But that's what Beelzebub means. The word Beelzebub means Lord of the Flies.
Yeah, I want to make it a point explicitly. What we're talking around is that the idea of a cultural revolution, I really believe that what's being attempted here is a Cultural Revolution 2.0 based on Chinese infiltration of our institutions, implementing the principles that were Mao's Cultural Revolution here in America. That's what's being attempted.
And they're very successful with it. And if you're willing to allow your children to grow up without any ability to understand that facts are what matters, and yeah, I understand feelings and all that, but feelings can't drive facts. Facts are facts.
Well, specifically, it's moral facts. It's an objective moral fact. That's the thing that they're most afraid of. It is an objective moral fact.
Yeah, and a society of people that believe in God via their personal relationships, though personal relationship with God gives you that moral standard in your being. And if that's broad enough in society, if that exists at enough individuals in society, it truly can't be controlled from the outside. And that's what the tyrants fear the most.
Yep. And so chaos, the ability to wage war on others, the growth of organizations such as Black Lives Matters, Antifa, and like-minded groups that then think that they can wander through the streets of a city like Portland, Oregon. If you've seen the videos online about what they've done, these Antifa members, over certain weekends, where they've declared the downtown an area where white males are not allowed, and as somebody driving in their car attempts to just pass through peacefully into another portion of the city that they'd like to go to, they are turned around by mobs of these people that are acting as if they're anti-fascists when in reality they are the neo-fascists. And this is accepted because the mayor of the city, I'm using Portland as an example, but you could use Berkeley and other cities as other examples, are not just turning a blind eye to it, but are actually promoting it. How do you survive that?
You pray.
Move to the country.
You get on Discord, you talk to your friends that can see all this stuff, and we feel a little bit more, justified and vindicated in our...
Yeah, so we've been going at it now for about an hour, and I'll need to wind things down on my end. Is there any, let's go person by person with any closing thoughts. Abigail?
I was kind of joking when I said, when you asked the question and I said pray, but it really is, if it weren't for, as I believe, the power of God, who we know and trust, wants there to be liberty and justice, and just the principles that the nation was founded on. That the Bill of Rights doesn't give us rights; it enumerates rights that are given us by God. It's that hope in a higher power who wants us to be established as free people that allows me to have hope that we can indeed have a restoration of our U.S. Republic.
Errol.
If we want to have justice, if we want to have peace, work for justice, the individual is the seat of justice to execute that judgment in a court or whatever.
Bandit.
Well, I think we have to teach our children. There are those of us of the age, and we have children. I've taught my kids to second guess the teachers they have. They're to know the difference between facts and opinion, and to take the opinion with a grain of salt and to weigh it out and to just use common sense on it. And does it make sense to you? If it does, fine, understand it and believe it. But if it doesn't make any sense to you, don't. And I think there's a lot of people my age and my age group that are teaching their kids, don't go by what school tells you. Don't listen. Have an open mind. Don't be indoctrinated. And we gotta hope that I hope that there's a lot of people out there that are educating their children separately from the school system.
Brainstorm.
I think this system of slavery that we're in is a mental slavery. They have figured out a way to remove the chains and just cause us to police ourselves, and that's Jeremy Bentham's his idea of panopticon, and that's DARPA symbolism if you look into the DARPA thing, but it's mind control. And the thing is, we need to do something to regain our own control. You know, the left has their safe spaces and stuff like that, and we make fun of them for it. But in actuality, I mean, their whole oppression Olympics that they engage in, we're the ones that have been oppressed. And I don't think we should be feeling sorry for ourselves about it. We should actually take control of our lives. And the easiest way to do that is to have a circle of friends where you can engage in a little lifelong learning. Don't think that when you get out of school that you're done learning. Now you should be able to know how to learn, and now you just get a bunch of friends that have similar goals and start learning together. And you start talking about current events, and you delve a little bit even into history. But what are the principles by which you live? What are the things that are at issue right now in the world that you find yourself? By talking about it, then you take control of the narrative structure of what you believe the world to be, and understand what your place in that world is and how you should behave in it so that as to create a better society for everyone. So lifelong learning, personal learning networks, that's what we need to do.
I agree. And so this has been a great discussion. I appreciate the participation by everyone present, and Abigail, Arrow, Bandit, and Brainstorm. This has been a great learning experience. And so this is DC Hammer and signing off for the DC Hammer Show. God bless. And now the DC Hammer Show is available as an audio podcast. Just go to Podcast Garden or iTunes and search for DC Hammer or News Narrative Analysis Associates, NNAA.